A man who has everything will eventually wonder what people see when all the wealth disappears. On a gray Monday morning, before the first customers stepped through the front door and before the smell of fresh coffee drifted across the dining room, the quiet rhythm of dishes echoed through the kitchen of Maple and Ash Bistro in downtown Chicago. Steam floated beneath bright ceiling lights while stacks of white plates waited beside industrial sinks, and among the cooks, servers, and delivery workers stood a man no one bothered to notice. He wore faded rubber gloves, a plain navy apron, worn work boots, and a simple baseball cap pulled low over silver-streaked brown hair. Every few seconds he dipped another plate into hot water with calm precision, never rushing, never complaining, moving with the patience of someone who had mastered something far greater than washing dishes. To everyone else, he was simply Nate, the new dishwasher hired through a temporary agency after another employee quit without notice. Nobody asked many questions because dishwashers came and went every few weeks. Nobody imagined that beneath those ordinary clothes stood Nathaniel Hayes, one of the wealthiest businessmen in America, a man whose face occasionally appeared on financial magazines and business television, but whose features looked surprisingly ordinary without tailored suits, polished shoes, or security teams surrounding him. Nathaniel had disappeared from his own world 3 weeks earlier, leaving only a carefully worded message with his board of directors explaining that he needed time away from every meeting, every interview, and every executive office. No journalist knew where he had gone. No investor understood why his calendar had suddenly become empty. That mystery was exactly how he wanted it. The restaurant became his hiding place, and the noisy kitchen became the first place in decades where nobody cared how much he was worth. Across the dining room, Claire Bennett adjusted the strings of her black apron before greeting the breakfast crowd with the same gentle smile she offered every morning. At 28, she had learned that people revealed themselves long before they finished speaking. Some revealed themselves through generous tips, others through impatient sighs, some by thanking the busboy, others by pretending he did not exist. Claire rarely judged anyone too quickly, but she quietly remembered everything she observed. Her coworkers sometimes joked that she noticed details nobody else could see. She smiled whenever they said it because they were right. She noticed wedding rings that suddenly disappeared, expensive shoes covered with fresh construction dust, hands that belonged to musicians instead of mechanics, eyes that carried exhaustion no amount of makeup could hide. That morning, while carrying a tray of coffee mugs toward the kitchen, she glanced past the swinging door just long enough to notice the new dishwasher reaching for another rack of plates. Something caught the light for less than a second. Beneath the edge of his glove, hidden almost completely by soap and water, rested the polished edge of an elegant Swiss watch unlike anything she had ever seen in person. It was subtle, almost invisible, but its craftsmanship stood out with unmistakable precision. Claire slowed her steps without realizing it. Every instinct told her something about the man did not fit the room. Not because he looked important. Quite the opposite. He worked too naturally, too carefully, almost as though every movement had been chosen instead of learned. Most new employees looked nervous during their first weeks. He looked peaceful. One of the line cooks shouted for more clean plates, and the dishwasher answered with a polite smile before rolling another rack toward the service station. His voice was calm, educated, impossible to place. Claire continued walking, yet the image stayed with her. A dishwasher wearing a watch that could probably pay off someone's mortgage made no sense at all. She said nothing. She asked nothing. She simply carried the coffee into the dining room, unaware that a single quiet observation had just placed her on a path that would change 2 lives forever. The breakfast rush settled into its familiar rhythm as sunlight stretched across the front windows and reflected against polished coffee cups waiting beside the espresso machine. Customers came and went with hurried conversations about meetings, school drop-offs, and stock prices. Yet Claire Bennett moved through the dining room with the same quiet confidence that made even the busiest mornings seem manageable. She remembered regular customers by the way they held their mugs instead of their names. She knew which retired teacher preferred extra lemon in her tea and which firefighter always ordered pancakes after an overnight shift. Those details mattered to her because they reminded her that every person carried a story invisible to everyone else. It was a lesson her late father had taught her years before. He used to say that kindness was easiest to recognize when nobody expected it. Claire had never forgotten those words. Around noon, the restaurant grew louder as business professionals filled nearly every table. Orders arrived faster than the kitchen could prepare them. Glasses clinked together, chairs scraped across hardwood floors, and voices blended into a steady hum. Through the small window connecting the kitchen to the dining room, Claire occasionally caught sight of Nate calmly loading another rack of dishes into the steaming machine. Nothing about him seemed rushed. Even when cooks demanded clean plates or servers accidentally stacked dirty trays in the wrong place, he answered with the same polite smile. Nobody thanked him very often. Nobody apologized when they created extra work. He simply nodded and continued. Claire noticed something else that afternoon. During his short lunch break, while everyone else checked social media or hurried through a sandwich, Nate unfolded a worn paperback book from his lunch bag. It was not a mystery novel or sports magazine. It was a thick volume about classical architecture filled with handwritten notes in the margins. Before she could read the title, another server called her name, and she returned to the dining room. But curiosity quietly settled into the back of her mind. Later that afternoon, an elderly customer accidentally dropped a ceramic coffee mug near the entrance. The cup shattered into dozens of small pieces, and several guests instinctively stepped backward. Before anyone else reacted, Nate appeared from the kitchen carrying only a broom and a dustpan. He knelt carefully, smiled at the embarrassed woman, and said, "Please do not worry. Cups can be replaced. People cannot." His voice remained calm enough that the woman's anxious expression softened almost immediately. Claire watched from across the room. Most people working long shifts eventually showed frustration. Nate never seemed to. It was not forced politeness. It felt genuine, almost effortless. When the dining room quieted again, Claire carried a fresh glass of ice water toward the kitchen. She paused beside the dish station. "You have been on your feet since 6 this morning," she said. "You should probably drink something besides coffee." Nate accepted the glass with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Claire. Most people only notice the clean plates." She smiled gently. Someone has to notice the person washing them. For just a second, something changed in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but recognition, as though he had not heard those words in a very long time. He thanked her again and returned to work. Claire walked away before the moment became awkward, unaware that her simple gesture lingered in his thoughts far longer than either of them expected. From the office balcony overlooking one of the largest corporations in the country, executives competed for recognition every single day. Inside this small neighborhood restaurant, nobody competed to notice the dishwasher. Yet the one person who did not care about titles had quietly offered him the only thing he had not been able to purchase with billions of dollars. She had seen him as a human being before she ever wondered who he might have been. Nathaniel Hayes continued scrubbing another plate beneath warm water as the afternoon light slowly faded outside. But for the first time since beginning his unusual experiment, he realized that perhaps he had already found the answer he had been searching for. Even though Claire herself had no idea that the quiet stranger standing behind the sink was carefully observing every act of kindness that unfolded around him. The following morning arrived wrapped in cool autumn air, and the city outside the restaurant moved with its usual restless determination. Delivery trucks rumbled along the street before sunrise, commuters hurried toward train stations with paper cups in their hands, and the first golden light reflected against the restaurant windows. Inside Maple and Ash Bistro, the familiar sounds returned one by one. Coffee beans were ground into fragrant powder. Silverware clinked softly as servers prepared each table. Fresh bread emerged from the oven, filling the dining room with warmth before the first guest arrived. Claire Bennett tied her apron and quietly reviewed the reservation book while exchanging cheerful greetings with her coworkers. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet every time she walked past the kitchen doors, she found herself glancing toward the dish station almost without thinking. Nate was already there, standing exactly where he always stood, carefully arranging stacks of spotless plates with remarkable precision. He never seemed rushed. He never wasted movement. Even the way he folded kitchen towels looked deliberate, as though every simple task deserved respect. During the late morning rush, an impatient customer complained loudly that his breakfast had taken too long. The young server assigned to the table apologized repeatedly, her face turning bright red with embarrassment. Before the kitchen manager could step in, Nate quietly carried a fresh tray of clean dishes across the room. As he passed the upset customer, he slowed just enough to hold the swinging kitchen door open for an elderly couple entering the restaurant. The older gentleman smiled gratefully, completely unaware that the quiet dishwasher had just prevented the heavy door from closing against his wife. Nate simply nodded and continued walking without expecting acknowledgement. Claire noticed the exchange from across the dining room. Small gestures. That was what defined people. Not speeches, not appearances, just the things they did when nobody rewarded them. Shortly after noon, another unusual detail caught her attention. A delivery driver arrived carrying several heavy produce boxes that needed to be stored immediately. The younger kitchen staff struggled to organize the crowded storage room, speaking over one another with growing frustration. Nate stepped forward without raising his voice. Within moments, he calmly suggested moving the dry goods to one shelf, rotating older inventory to the front, and stacking fresh vegetables according to temperature requirements. The chaotic room became organized in less than 10 minutes. Even the head chef paused for a second before quietly saying, "That actually makes a lot more sense." Nate only smiled and returned to the sink as though nothing unusual had happened. Claire could not ignore the growing list of questions forming in her mind. Dishwashers were rarely trained in inventory systems. Most certainly did not naturally speak with the confidence of someone accustomed to leading people. She said nothing, choosing instead to observe. Experience had taught her that truth revealed itself naturally to those patient enough to wait. That afternoon, the restaurant briefly lost power after a nearby electrical transformer failed. The dining room fell silent. The espresso machines stopped humming. The lights dimmed until only sunlight pouring through the front windows illuminated the room. Several employees immediately reached for their phones while customers exchanged uncertain looks. Before anyone began to panic, Nate calmly walked toward the emergency breaker panel located beside the kitchen office. He studied the electrical display for only a few moments before speaking in an even voice. The building backup system should restart automatically in less than 60 seconds. Let us keep everyone comfortable while we wait. His confidence settled the room almost instantly. Exactly 48 seconds later, the lights returned. The refrigerator compressors started again. The espresso machine beeped softly. Conversations resumed as though nothing had happened. The restaurant manager blinked in surprise. "How did you know that?" Nate wiped his hands on a clean towel before answering with an almost playful smile. "I have always enjoyed understanding how buildings work." It was such a simple reply that nobody questioned it further. Nobody except Claire. As the afternoon faded into evening, she carried a basket of fresh dinner rolls toward the kitchen. Passing the dish station once more, she noticed the Swiss watch again, hidden beneath the edge of his glove as sunlight reflected through the small kitchen window. It was impossible to mistake its craftsmanship twice. She had once served a jewelry collector who proudly showed photographs of watches worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. This one belonged in that same world, not beside industrial soap and steaming sinks. Nate caught her looking for only an instant before gently pulling his glove back into place. Neither of them spoke. Claire simply smiled politely and continued walking. But deep inside, she knew the quiet stranger standing behind those spotless dishes was protecting a story far larger than anyone inside Maple and Ash Bistro could possibly imagine. By the end of the first week, the restaurant had quietly settled into an unspoken routine, and without realizing it, everyone had assigned Nate a place in their daily lives. Some treated him with polite indifference. Others barely acknowledged him at all. A few spoke to him only when they needed another stack of clean plates delivered in a hurry. Nathaniel Hayes accepted every moment without complaint because this was exactly what he had come to discover. Titles disappeared quickly when hidden beneath an apron. Wealth became invisible behind a sink filled with warm water and soap. Reputation vanished the moment no one recognized a familiar face. Yet character remained impossible to disguise. Every morning, he watched the same people make the same choices. One cook always greeted the maintenance worker before starting his shift. Another employee routinely left dirty pans scattered across the kitchen, assuming someone else would clean them. The assistant manager often spoke warmly to customers, but impatiently to the kitchen staff. Nathaniel observed each interaction with quiet attention, storing every detail more carefully than any business report he had ever reviewed. Claire, however, remained different. She never changed her tone depending on who stood before her. Whether she served an attorney celebrating a promotion, a retired couple sharing breakfast, or a delivery driver stopping in for coffee, her voice carried the same calm respect. She thanked the busboys. She asked the dishwasher whether he had eaten lunch. She smiled at the hostess after difficult customers walked away. None of it felt rehearsed. It was simply who she was. One rainy afternoon, the dining room filled earlier than expected as people escaped the cold weather outside. Umbrellas lined the entrance, coats dripped onto the floor, and every table quickly became occupied. Orders poured into the kitchen faster than anyone anticipated. Pressure spread through the staff like invisible electricity. The head chef called for more clean dishes every few minutes. Servers hurried between crowded aisles balancing heavy trays, while the manager repeatedly reminded everyone to move faster. In the middle of the rush, one young busboy accidentally dropped an entire tray of freshly polished glasses into a rolling cart. The sharp crash echoed across the restaurant, followed by complete silence. The teenager froze where he stood, convinced he had just ruined his first week on the job. The manager immediately turned toward him with visible frustration already rising across his face. Before a single harsh word could be spoken, Nate quietly stepped between them. He placed a reassuring hand on the frightened young man's shoulder and said with an easy smile, "Everyone learns faster after making one honest mistake. Let us clean this together and keep the guests comfortable." His voice carried no judgment, only calm certainty. Something unexpected happened. The manager took a slow breath, nodded once, and simply instructed everyone to continue working. The moment passed as quickly as it had arrived. Claire had witnessed everything from the coffee station. Most people measured leadership by authority. She had just watched leadership appear from the least powerful position in the building. Later that evening, after the final dinner guests had left, Claire found Nate wiping down the stainless steel counters near the dish station. She handed him a warm cup of fresh coffee instead of leaving it on the counter. "You helped that young busboy today," she said softly. "He will remember that for a long time." Nate looked at the rising steam before answering. "Someone once gave me patience when I needed it most. I have spent years trying to return the favor." Claire smiled. Not everyone remembers kindness after success. For the first time since arriving at the restaurant, Nathaniel hesitated before replying. Her words settled deeper than she realized because they reached the very reason he had walked away from boardrooms, private jets, and executive offices. He had begun to fear that success often erased gratitude instead of strengthening it. Yet standing inside this modest kitchen, speaking with a waitress who valued people more than appearances, he found himself questioning whether hope had truly disappeared from the world. Outside, the rain continued tapping gently against the restaurant windows while the last lights reflected across the wet sidewalk. Inside, neither of them noticed that a black luxury sedan had slowly driven past the building for the third evening in a row before disappearing into traffic again. Claire assumed it belonged to someone dining nearby. Nathaniel recognized it immediately, but revealed nothing. The people searching for him were becoming more persistent, and sooner or later, the quiet life he had carefully built behind the dish sink would no longer remain hidden. The second week began with crisp October air drifting through the alley behind the restaurant, carrying the scent of rain-soaked brick and fallen leaves. The city moved with the same relentless pace, but inside Maple and Ash Bistro, time seemed to follow a quieter rhythm. Claire Bennett had stopped wondering whether Nate was different. She already knew he was. The only question that remained was why someone with his quiet confidence had chosen a place where almost nobody looked beyond a stained apron. She continued treating him exactly as she had on his first day, never asking personal questions, never forcing conversation, simply offering the same respect she believed every person deserved. Nathaniel noticed that consistency more than she could imagine. Throughout his career, people had changed the moment they learned his name. Investors became warmer. Strangers became friendlier. Business rivals suddenly admired his opinions. Claire had done the opposite. She treated the unknown dishwasher with the same kindness she offered every customer, every cook, every delivery driver, and every busboy. There was no performance in her actions. Late one afternoon, after the lunch crowd had finally disappeared, the restaurant settled into an unusual silence. The dishwasher hummed softly while clean plates dried on steel racks. Claire carried fresh linens toward the storage room, when a black luxury sedan slowly rolled into the narrow service alley behind the building. It stopped for less than 30 seconds. A well-dressed man stepped out, wearing a charcoal overcoat despite the mild weather. He glanced around carefully before walking toward the rear entrance. Claire instinctively stepped aside, assuming he was another supplier. Instead of entering through the kitchen, the visitor paused beside Nate. His posture remained respectful, almost formal. Claire could not hear every word over the sound of running water, but one sentence drifted clearly across the room. "Sir, the board cannot delay the meeting any longer." Nate did not even look up immediately. He finished rinsing the plate already in his hands before quietly replying, "I asked for 3 weeks." The visitor lowered his voice. "It has already been 20 days, Mr. Hayes." Claire froze where she stood. Mr. Hayes. The name echoed in her thoughts with unsettling familiarity. She had seen it before on magazine covers displayed near the grocery checkout lines. Hayes Global Industries, one of the largest companies in the country. Nathaniel finally looked toward the visitor with calm eyes. "Please tell them they will have my answer soon." The man gave a respectful nod before returning to the waiting sedan, which disappeared into afternoon traffic as quietly as it had arrived. For several seconds, the only sound inside the kitchen came from warm water flowing across porcelain dishes. Claire remained hidden behind the partially opened storage room door, her heart unexpectedly racing. She looked toward the quiet dishwasher who had already returned to work exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. He scrubbed another plate, dried another glass, lifted another tray. Nothing in his movements suggested the urgency of someone responsible for thousands of employees and billions of dollars. The realization settled slowly instead of arriving all at once. The watch, the architecture book, the leadership, the calm confidence, the luxury sedan that had circled the building for days. Every unexplained detail suddenly fit together with remarkable clarity. Claire could have walked directly into the kitchen and confronted him. She could have told the manager. She could have searched the internet for confirmation before the end of her shift. Instead, she quietly picked up the stack of folded tablecloths and continued working exactly as she had only minutes earlier. When Nate carried another rack of clean dishes into the dining room, she thanked him with the same gentle smile she always offered. Nothing more, nothing less. Nathaniel noticed the brief pause in her eyes. He sensed that something had changed, although she gave him no reason to be certain. For the first time since beginning his unusual journey, he wondered whether someone had finally seen beyond the disguise. Yet what surprised him most was not the possibility of being recognized. It was the peaceful certainty that if anyone inside this restaurant could be trusted with the truth, it would be the quiet waitress who had never once cared about the title standing behind the sink. The discovery remained locked inside Claire Bennett's heart for the next several days, protected not by fear but by choice. She spoke to no one. She searched for nothing online. She did not compare photographs or read business articles. Somehow she already knew enough. The quiet man standing behind the dish sink was living inside a world that did not belong to this restaurant. Yet every morning he returned before sunrise, tied the same worn apron around his waist, and greeted every coworker with the same humble smile. Claire found that far more interesting than the fortune he had chosen to hide. The more she observed him, the more she realized that wealth had never been the most remarkable thing about him. It was discipline. It was patience. It was the strange peace that surrounded him even when everyone else hurried through another exhausting shift. Nathaniel, however, sensed that something had changed. Claire still treated him exactly the same, but there was now a quiet awareness behind her eyes. She no longer looked surprised when he solved unexpected problems or spoke with calm authority. She simply accepted those moments without comment. That silent understanding fascinated him. Throughout his career, people usually reacted to power with excitement, curiosity, or ambition. Claire reacted with respect for his privacy. One evening, after the dinner rush had finally slowed, the assistant manager announced that one of the newer servers had accidentally entered several incorrect orders into the computer system. The young woman stood near the register fighting back tears, convinced she would be sent home or lose her job. A few frustrated employees quietly blamed her for delaying the kitchen during the busiest hour of the night. Before anyone could continue the criticism, Claire stepped forward. "I entered 2 of those modifications while helping another table," she said calmly. "If anyone should stay late fixing the reports, I will help." The young server immediately shook her head. No, Claire. Those mistakes were mine. Claire smiled gently. Then we will correct them together. Without another word, she walked beside the younger employee toward the office and spent nearly an hour reorganizing receipts and correcting every order before the restaurant closed. She never mentioned the extra time. She never asked for recognition. Nathaniel watched the entire moment from the dish station. Nobody had asked Claire to share the responsibility. Nobody expected her to sacrifice her own evening for someone she barely knew. She simply refused to let another person carry embarrassment alone. That single decision affected him more deeply than any boardroom presentation or leadership seminar he had attended in decades. As the last lights in the dining room were switched off, Claire stepped into the kitchen to return a clean tray. Nathaniel dried his hands and looked toward her with thoughtful curiosity. May I ask you something? He said. Claire nodded. Of course. He rested the towel across the counter before speaking again. Suppose a dishwasher told you he was actually one of the wealthiest men in America. Would you believe him? Claire looked at him quietly for several seconds. There was no surprise on her face. No laughter. Only calm reflection. Finally, she smiled with the same gentle warmth she had shown since the first morning they met. Whether I believed him would not matter very much, she answered. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. Why not? Claire folded the tray beneath her arm. Because tomorrow morning he would still have to decide how he speaks to people, how he treats coworkers, and whether he keeps his promises. Money cannot make those choices for anyone. The kitchen became completely still. Even the dishwasher had finished its final cycle. Nathaniel held her words in silence, recognizing that she had answered a much deeper question than the one he had asked. Claire wished him a pleasant evening and walked toward the employee exit without looking back. She never mentioned the name Hayes. She never acknowledged the visitor from the black sedan. She protected his secret with nothing more than quiet dignity. Standing alone beside rows of spotless dishes, Nathaniel realized that his greatest discovery had never been hidden inside the restaurant at all. It had been quietly carrying coffee, remembering birthdays, encouraging strangers, and choosing kindness every single day without expecting the world to notice. The following Friday began like every other day, yet something in the air felt unusually still. A soft mist drifted across the sidewalks outside Maple and Ash Bistro while the first rays of sunlight reflected against the restaurant windows. Claire Bennett unlocked the front entrance, switched on the dining room lights, and quietly arranged fresh flowers in the center of each table. The familiar routines brought comfort, but she could not ignore the feeling that an invisible clock had almost reached its final second. When she stepped into the kitchen, Nate was already standing at the sink, carefully polishing the last tray from the previous evening. He greeted her with the same gentle smile. Good morning, Claire. Good morning, Nate, she replied. Neither of them mentioned the conversation they had shared 2 nights before. Neither of them spoke about secrets. They simply returned to work. Around 10 o'clock, the peaceful rhythm of the restaurant changed without warning. One black sedan stopped in front of the entrance. Then another. Then a third. Within minutes, nearly a dozen dark vehicles lined both sides of the street. Employees paused in the middle of carrying trays. Customers looked through the windows with quiet curiosity. Even the chef stepped away from the kitchen to see what was happening. Several men and women wearing tailored business suits stepped onto the sidewalk with calm professionalism. They were not loud. They were not intimidating. Yet everything about their posture suggested purpose. The restaurant manager hurried toward the entrance, assuming an important private event had arrived without a reservation. Before he could greet anyone, one distinguished woman carrying a leather portfolio politely asked, "Is Mr. Nathaniel Hayes here?" The manager looked confused. "I am sorry. We do not have anyone by that name working here." Claire stood only a few feet away. She remained perfectly still. She already knew the answer. The woman smiled respectfully. "I believe you do." At that exact moment, Nate quietly walked out of the kitchen carrying a rack of freshly polished glasses. The visitors immediately straightened their posture. Without hesitation, every one of them greeted him with the same simple words. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes." The restaurant fell completely silent. Glasses stopped clinking. Coffee cups remained suspended halfway to waiting tables. Even the music playing softly through the ceiling speakers seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the unexpected moment. The manager stared at the dishwasher with wide eyes. One of the cooks slowly removed his apron as though convinced he had misunderstood everything he had seen during the past 3 weeks. Nathaniel carefully placed the rack of glasses onto the counter before removing his rubber gloves. He folded them neatly beside the sink, wiped his hands with a clean towel, and looked around the kitchen with quiet gratitude. There was no dramatic speech waiting inside him. No expression of pride. Only calm honesty. "I owe all of you an explanation," he said softly. The employees gathered naturally around the dish station, still unable to process what they had just witnessed. Nathaniel looked toward the manager first. "Thank you for giving a stranger an opportunity without asking about his past." He turned toward the cooks. "Thank you for your patience while I learned your routines." Then his eyes settled on Claire. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. She simply returned the same peaceful smile she had offered since his first morning behind the sink. Nathaniel finally continued. "My name is Nathaniel Hayes. I came here because I wanted to remember what people looked like when they were not looking at my position." Quiet surprise spread across every face in the room. Some employees immediately remembered newspaper articles. Others whispered his name beneath their breath. The young busboy who had once dropped the tray of glasses looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. The assistant manager lowered his eyes, replaying every impatient conversation he had ever had with the quiet dishwasher. Only Claire remained unchanged. She did not step backward. She did not suddenly become nervous. She simply stood exactly where she had always stood, seeing not the billionaire everyone else had suddenly discovered, but the man who had quietly washed dishes beside them every single day. Silence lingered inside the restaurant long after Nathaniel Hayes revealed his identity. No one seemed certain how to continue a morning that had suddenly become unforgettable. The manager cleared his throat twice before quietly apologizing for every impatient instruction he had given during the past 3 weeks. Nathaniel simply smiled and shook his head. "You treated me like every other employee," he said gently. That was the entire point. His answer seemed to lift a weight from the room, yet another kind of discomfort remained. Several employees replayed their own words in silence, remembering moments they wished they could erase. Nathaniel carried no resentment. Instead, he thanked each person individually for allowing him to become part of their ordinary routines. He thanked the chef for insisting that every plate leaving the kitchen should be worthy of pride. He thanked the busboy for always staying late without being asked. He even thanked the assistant manager for expecting excellence every day because responsibility, when balanced with respect, helped people grow. Finally, he turned toward Claire Bennett. Every conversation in the room seemed to fade into the background. "Claire," he said softly, "would you walk with me for a moment?" She nodded, and together they stepped outside into the cool October air. The black sedans remained parked quietly along the curb, their drivers respectfully keeping their distance. Fallen leaves drifted across the sidewalk while the city continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Nathaniel looked back at the restaurant before speaking. "You knew several days ago." Claire smiled faintly. "Yes. Why did you never ask me about it?" She folded her hands inside the pockets of her apron. "Because it was your story to tell, not mine to uncover." Nathaniel lowered his eyes for a moment. During decades of negotiations worth billions of dollars, he had rarely been left without an immediate response. Yet those simple words reached him more deeply than any compliment he had ever received. After a quiet pause, he reached into his coat pocket and removed a cream-colored envelope bearing the Hayes Global Industries seal. "I would like to offer you a position," he said. "Not because you were kind to me. Kindness should never become a transaction. I want you to help lead a new foundation that will invest in education, career development, and leadership opportunities for restaurant workers, hotel employees, custodians, dishwashers, and everyone whose work is often overlooked. I believe you understand people better than most executives I have ever met." Claire accepted the envelope without opening it. She looked at the elegant paper for several seconds before returning it to him with both hands. Nathaniel appeared surprised. "You are saying no?" Claire nodded gently. "I am saying not yet." He listened carefully. "This restaurant gave me my first chance after a difficult season in my life. These people became my family before they knew your name. I cannot walk away simply because a better opportunity appears." Nathaniel smiled, but this time there was unmistakable admiration in his eyes. "What if the position waits?" Claire looked toward the dining room window where the young busboy was laughing with another employee while polishing silverware. Then perhaps one day I will be ready. Nathaniel slipped the envelope back into his pocket without disappointment. You are the first person who has ever declined one of my offers because of loyalty instead of fear. Claire laughed quietly. I did not decline the mission, only the timing. For the first time in many years, Nathaniel felt something that could never be measured on a financial statement. Respect earned without influence. Trust offered without conditions. Standing on an ordinary sidewalk beside an ordinary neighborhood restaurant, the billionaire who had spent his life building companies realized that true leadership was not found in the tallest office or the largest boardroom. Sometimes it stood behind a coffee tray, quietly choosing people before opportunity, integrity before promotion, and purpose before prestige. At that moment, he knew his experiment had not merely answered an old question. It had quietly given him a new direction for the rest of his life. 6 months passed quietly, and winter slowly surrendered to the first signs of spring. The maple trees lining the streets outside Maple and Ash Bistro carried fresh green leaves once again, while the familiar bell above the restaurant door welcomed another ordinary morning. Customers still gathered for coffee before work. The retired teacher still ordered tea with extra lemon. Firefighters still stopped by after overnight shifts. Some things had not changed at all, and Claire Bennett was grateful for that. She still tied the same black apron every morning. She still remembered birthdays, favorite meals, and quiet smiles that needed no explanation. Yet there was one difference everyone inside the restaurant noticed. The atmosphere itself had become gentler. Employees greeted one another more often. Managers thanked the kitchen staff before leaving each evening. New hires were introduced by name instead of job title. Without announcing any grand policy, people had simply begun treating one another with greater respect. It was as though one quiet experiment had left an invisible mark on every person who had witnessed it. Nathaniel Hayes never purchased the restaurant, although many people assumed he would. Instead, he chose something much simpler. Every month, an anonymous delivery arrived containing scholarships for hospitality students, emergency assistance for employees facing unexpected hardships, and professional development opportunities for workers who dreamed of advancing their careers. The gifts never carried his photograph. They never asked for publicity. Only a small handwritten card accompanied each package. It always contained the same sentence: every meaningful career deserves dignity. The staff eventually recognized the handwriting, but nobody spoke about it aloud. Some acts of generosity felt more powerful when they remained quiet. One afternoon, Claire received an invitation to visit the headquarters of Hayes Global Industries. She accepted, not because of the impressive building or the opportunity itself, but because she had promised Nathaniel that when the time felt right, she would listen. Walking through the lobby, she noticed something unexpected. There were no marble statues celebrating profits, no enormous portraits honoring executives. Instead, the entrance displayed photographs of janitors, receptionists, cafeteria workers, security officers, drivers, maintenance crews, and administrative assistants. Beneath every photograph appeared a simple sentence describing how that individual had strengthened the company through character rather than position. Nathaniel welcomed Claire personally. His suit was perfectly tailored once again, yet something about him felt lighter than before. They stood together beside the large windows overlooking the city where countless people hurried through another ordinary day. "Do you remember what you told me in the kitchen?" he asked. Claire smiled. "I have probably said many things in kitchens." Nathaniel laughed softly before repeating her words exactly. Tomorrow morning, he would still have to decide how he speaks to people. Claire nodded. "I remember." Nathaniel looked toward the employees moving through the headquarters below. "Those words changed the way I lead this company." He explained that every executive now spent 1 week each year working alongside frontline employees, not for publicity, but for perspective. Managers attended listening sessions instead of delivering speeches. Promotion reviews now included how leaders treated the people with the least authority. Productivity had improved, employee satisfaction had increased, but Nathaniel insisted those numbers mattered less than something impossible to measure. People had begun seeing one another again. Before Claire returned to the restaurant, Nathaniel handed her a small wooden box. Inside rested the elegant Swiss watch she had noticed beneath his rubber glove on the very first morning. She looked at him with surprise. "I cannot accept this." Nathaniel gently closed the lid and smiled. "It is not a gift. It belongs in the company museum now. I only wanted you to see it one last time." He carefully placed the watch back into the box. "For years I believed this represented success. Then I spent 3 weeks washing dishes and realized it was simply a way to tell time." Claire laughed quietly, and together they walked toward the elevator. As she stepped outside into the afternoon sunshine, she realized the most valuable thing either of them had carried away from those weeks inside Maple and Ash Bistro had never been hidden inside a bank account, an expensive watch, or a famous name. It had lived inside ordinary conversations, unnoticed acts of kindness, and the quiet courage to treat every human being with equal dignity before knowing what they could ever offer in return. Because in the end, the people who change the world are rarely the loudest voices in the room. More often, they are simply the ones who never forget that every person deserves to be seen.